Hadirin sekalian, jajaran pimpinan di lingkungan Kementerian Keuangan beserta tamu undangan memasuki ruang acara. Hadirin dimohon berdiri. Hadirin yang kami hormati, dalam perjalanan panjang sebuah institusi, sejarah panjang bukan hanya menjadi kenangan yang terpatri, namun juga menjadi cahaya penerang, menuntun langkah ke masa depan yang gemilang.
Selanjutnya, mari kita saksikan bersama penayangan video pengenalan logo Diesnatalis ke-11 Politeknik Keuangan Negara. Selamat menyaksikan.
Diesnatalis ke-11 PKN STAN bukan hanya peringatan perjalanan,
melainkan sebuah refleksi nilai, identitas, dan semangat yang terus tumbuh bersama.
Sebelas helai burung merak melambangkan 11 tahun perjalanan PKN STAN. Perjalanan yang menunjukkan ketangguhan, dedikasi, dan keberlanjutan pengabdian dalam negeri. Bunga hibiscus melambangkan kemampuan untuk terus beradaptasi di berbagai lingkungan, serta semangat untuk senantiasa memberikan pengabdian yang tulus. Kristal ametis melambangkan kemurnian jiwa dan transformasi diri.
motif megang mendung dan kalung melambangkan kebijaksanaan, ketekunan, dan semangat pantang menyerah.
Nilai yang tetap berakar pada jati diri bangsa.
Warna ungu melambangkan kreativitas.
Semangat untuk terus menghadirkan gagasan dan karya yang berdampak.
Warna biru merepresentasikan profesionalisme dan kepercayaan. Tentunya sebagai landasan dalam menjaga amanah dan tanggung jawab. Warna emas melambangkan pencapaian dan harapan.
Simbol perjalanan pengabdian yang terus bertumbuh.
Kasih ya.
Warna merah muda mencerminkan ketulusan, kepedulian, dan harmoni. Nilai yang memperkuat semangat kebersamaan dalam berkarya.
Warna putih melambangkan kejujuran dan kemurnian niat sebagai dasar integritas dalam memberikan pengabdian terbaik bagi negeri.
Diesnatalis ke-11 PKN STAN, 11 warsa mendidik rasa, bakti kreasi bagi bangsa.
Pembukaan Sidang Senat dan Orasi Ilmiah Diesnatalis ke-11 Politeknik Keuangan Negara oleh Ketua Senat Politeknik Keuangan Negara, Bapak Dr. Ivan Yulianto SE/MSE.
Hadirin yang saya hormati, pada hari ini Kamis tanggal 2 Juli tahun 2026, Politeknik Keuangan Negara menyelenggarakan sidang Senat terbuka dalam rangka Diesnatalis Politeknik Keuangan Negara ke-11 tahun 2026. Dengan mengharap ridho Allah dan dengan mengucapkan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, sidang Senat terbuka Politeknik Keuangan Negara secara resmi dinyatakan dibuka.
Selanjutnya, sambutan oleh Direktur Politeknik Keuangan Negara STAN kepada Ibu Evi Mulyani AK MBA PhD. Kami silakan.
Baik, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Yang terhormat Ketua Senat Politeknik Keuangan Negara STAN, Bapak Ivan Yulianto, beserta Sekretaris Senat PKN STAN dan seluruh anggota Senat, semua, Bapak-Bapak Ketua, Sekretaris, dan anggota Senat PKN STAN, saya juga menyapa, menghaturkan selamat datang dan terima kasih atas perkenan kehadiran Ibu Bapak Eselon 2 dari BPPK, Badan Pendidikan Pelatihan dan Keuangan, Pak Ses, dan Ibu Bapak Kapus, kemudian tentunya Ibu Bapak Pimpinan Kementerian Keuangan Kemenkeu Banten, tempat secara geografis kampus kita berada. Jadi bagian dari Kemenkeu Banten, Pak Kapar, Pak Aim, juga Ibu Bapak, terima kasih atas kehadiran. Ibu Bapak sekalian, seluruh sivitas akademika PKN STAN, dosen, mahasiswa, juga seluruh tenaga kependidikan. Dan di pagi ini izinkan saya menyampaikan beberapa pengingat saja, ini refresh 11 years of dedication to the nation. Tema tadi sudah diperkenalkan dengan berbagai warna-warni dan bentuknya, tema Diesnatalis ke-11 PKN STAN tahun 2020. Jadi Bapak sekalian, tepatnya 15 Juli 2026 PKN STAN merayakan, memperingati ulang tahun atau Diesnatalis yang ke-11. Tema tahun ini selaras sejalan dengan sudah 11 tahun Ekadasa Dharma Nusa, bahasa Sanskerta yang artinya 11 years of dedication to the nation. Dan pada hari ini alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim kita berkumpul dalam suasana tentunya penuh rasa syukur untuk memperingati Diesnatalis ke-11 tersebut. 11 warsa pengabdian bagi bangsa tentunya bukan sekedar penanda usia kelembagaan, itu barangkali yang saya izin untuk kita semua merefresh kembali apa yang ada di dalam memori kita. Tentunya Diesnatalis ke-11 ini merupakan pengingat bahwa setiap perjalanan PKN STAN tentu selama ini dengan sinergi kontribusi teman-teman, rekan-rekan BPPK dan tentunya Kemenkeu Banten selalu melekat satu kata kunci, dedication, pengabdian. 11 tahun perjalanan PKN STAN tentunya transformasi itu yang terjadi seperti layaknya di institusi lain termasuk di Kementerian Keuangan, dan kita tidak hanya sekedar merayakan hari lahir atau hari jadi suatu institusi atau pendidikan tinggi vokasi, tetapi kiranya kita meneguhkan kembali dedikasi kita, mandat besar yang diberikan kepada PKN STAN dan kita tidak bisa sendiri. Kita harus bersinergi dengan BPPK, dengan Kemenkeu Banten, dan tentunya dengan seluruh instansi tidak hanya nasional tetapi juga internasional. Kita menjadi bagian dari ekosistem, ini saya mengingatkan kepada seluruh sivitas akademika, PKN STAN menjadi bagian dari ekosistem Kementerian Keuangan dalam menyiapkan SDM keuangan negara, tentunya yang kompeten, berintegritas, dan siap memenuhi tantangan zaman, menyelesaikan tantangan yang ada. Diesnatalis merupakan refleksi sekaligus konsolidasi, tentunya refleksi bahwa kita melihat perjalanan dalam 11 tahun ini sejak menjadi Politeknik di 15 Juli 11 tahun lalu, 2015. Dan konsolidasi karena kita harus memastikan bahwa PKN STAN bergerak sejalan dengan transformasi di Kementerian Keuangan, arahan pimpinan, dan tentunya bahkan tentu berjalan berawal dari prioritas Presiden. Izinkan kami menyampaikan di 2 slide posisi strategis dan arah masa depan PKN STAN sebagai bentuk komitmen kami untuk terus memperkuat pengabdian bagi bangsa. But before I continue, allow me to extend our warmest welcome and highest appreciation to Professor Uwe Dulek from the University of Canberra, who's joining us through Zoom. Thank you, Prof. Dulek. And also Ibu Mira of the University of Canberra, one of our strategic partners from Australia, who has kindly joined us today and will deliver, Prof. Dulek will deliver the scientific oration for this Senate session. So Professor Dulek, we are truly honored by your presence. We believe that your insights will enrich our academic perspective, strengthen our international engagement, and inspire us, our academic community as we continue to develop a more relevant, adaptive, and globally connected institution. Ibu Mira, terima kasih atas perkenan sudah hadir melalui Zoom. And on behalf of PKN, thank you very much again, Professor Uwe Dulek, for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and experience. Di slide ini, Bu Bapak sekalian, izinkan kami menyampaikan, menggambarkan bahwa PKN tidak lahir tiba-tiba. Di ruangan ini banyak alumni yang luar biasa, yang inspiring, dan tentunya kita paham betul bahwa fondasi sejarah panjang pendidikan keuangan negara di PKN ini berawal di tahun bahkan 1948. Ketika kita mengatakan 11 tahun itu sekedar ketika kita sepenuhnya menjadi perguruan tinggi yang secara akademik mengikuti ketentuan di Kemendikti. Bertransform menjadi Stiken di tahun 59, kemudian IIK tahun 67, dan STAN pertama itu di tahun 1975. Di tahun lalu alhamdulillah saya hadir di reuni STAN angkatan pertama, angkatan 1975, dan di bulan ini ada undangan untuk menghadiri 50 tahun angkatan kedua STAN, artinya senior kita yang masuk ke STAN tahun 1976. Menyaksikan kedekatan senior-senior kita yang tahun lalu angkatan 75 sudah 50 tahun, dari sejak beliau bergabung belajar di STAN, kemudian menyaksikan bagaimana kontribusinya, sesuatu yang kemudian layak dan harus kita renungkan, dan bukan sekedar renungkan, tetapi banyak kemudian refleksi yang mestinya bisa menjadi penyemangat kita dalam bertransformasi. Untuk sivitas akademika dan juga alumni, kiranya saya perlu untuk kemudian mengingatkan kita semua bahwa kita memiliki di dalam rangkaian ini kita bisa melihat akar historis yang kuat. Tetapi tentu kekuatan itu tidak terletak pada sejarahnya, melainkan kemampuan kita untuk bertransformasi, dan kemudian sampai dengan kita lihat di 2020 ketika pandemik ada penyesuaian di berbagai hal termasuk di penerimaan SPMB, seleksi penerimaan mahasiswa baru 2021, sampai dengan saat ini kita berfokus pada peningkatan kualitas, dan kemudian kita sudah menerapkan 2 kurikulum secara bersamaan, akademik dan karakter, yang keduanya menentukan kelulusan. Itu proses transformasi yang kita laksanakan, dan tentunya dalam konteks kita melihat strategic presence kita di kotak yang tengah ini, Center of Excellence di bidang keuangan negara. Mestinya konsistensi PKN dalam konteks eksistensi PKN menempatkan diri sebagai Center of Excellence. Artinya tidak hanya menghasilkan lulusan, tetapi menjadi pusat keunggulan ilmu, bisa hadir dan aktif di berbagai asosiasi yang relevan. Ini untuk Ibu Bapak dosen, saya kesemangati di dalam kesempatan baik Diesnatalis ke-11 PKN STAN ini, dan tentunya karakter, termasuk juga bagaimana kembali lagi ke fondasi kompetensi yang harus senantiasa catch up, selalu ikut dan menjadi relevan dengan dinamika kebijakan dan pengelolaan atau praktek pengelolaan keuangan negara. Kemudian dari sisi reformasi birokrasi, ini hal yang juga menjadi sangat relevan, termasuk juga bagaimana kompetensi ketika menjadi fondasi untuk lulusan kita bicara apakah bicara karakter based kurikula, dan juga banyak dari sisi akademik yang harus terus kita perbaiki. Dari sisi digital transformation di sisi akademik, kita juga harus lebih kuat dan kita terus kuatkan, kita perkuat di bidang digital public finance. Di keuangan negara kita paham sekali bagaimana future of skill atau skills of tomorrow yang kita ambil dari World Economic Forum, kita include, kita insert ke dalam seluruh mata kuliah yang relevan. Case-based learning, project-based learning, termasuk bagaimana tim teaching dan laboratorium hidup yang juga dengan teman-teman KPPN, KPP menjadi salah satu jalan dalam upaya kita untuk tadi menghadirkan atau keberadaan kita berdampak, strategic presence. Dan tentunya yang muaranya, tujuan besarnya adalah mendukung visi Indonesia Emas yang ada di sisi kanan bawah di slide yang sedang ditayangkan. Bagaimana kita berperan dalam berbagai program strategis pemerintah melalui Tridharma, pendidikan, penelitian, atau tentunya outputnya adalah publikasi, outcome-nya novelty, rekomendasi kebijakan, dan pengabdian kepada masyarakat. Dan di dalam kesempatan ini, Ibu Bapak sekalian, silakan di slide terakhir. Ada satu kutipan yang saya minta teman-teman taruh di dalam slide saya. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Ini sangat relevan dalam konteks kita PKN STAN, khususnya ketika kita sudah menginjak 11 tahun bertransformasi, sejak bertransformasi menjadi perguruan tinggi sepenuhnya. Secara akademik kita mengikuti seluruh ketentuan Undang-Undang Pendidikan Nasional, Sisdiknas, Undang-Undang Dosen, dan berbagai turunan dari undang-undang tersebut. Bagi kita tentunya mestinya, ini saya mengingatkan diri sendiri juga kita semua PKN STAN, bahwa pendidikan bukan hanya proses transfer pengetahuan. Ibu Bapak dosen mengajar bukan hanya transfer pengetahuan, tetapi mestinya pendidikan yang ada di kampus ini membentuk cara berpikir. Bisa mengonek dari berbagai dots yang ada, kemudian membentuk suatu pemikiran, membentuk karakter dan integritas, serta keberanian untuk mengambil peran dalam memperbaiki bangsa. Karena itu dari quote ini saya kira kita melihat di dalam quote ini mestinya kita memahami bahwa tugas kita besar tidak sekedar menyelenggarakan pendidikan atau tridharma, tetapi membentuk manusia publik yang tidak pernah berhenti belajar, manusia publik yang profesional dan calon pemimpin keuangan negara. Dalam konteks keuangan negara masih diambil dari quote ini, mestinya kita bisa memaknai quote ini bahwa pendidikan yang dilakukan di PKN STAN mestinya memiliki daya ubah atau impact yang sangat besar. Integritas yang kita bentuk harusnya memang betul-betul dimulai dari kampus, dan saya mengingatkan di kesempatan ini bukan hanya mahasiswa, tapi seluruh sivitas akademika betul-betul mempunyai integritas karakter Kementerian Keuangan. Karena itu di Diesnatalis ke-11 ini sekali lagi saya mengajak kita semua sivitas akademika untuk memaknai sebagai panggilan untuk memperkuat kualitas pendidikan di PKN STAN secara menyeluruh. Tentunya kita ingin PKN STAN menjadi tempat yang tidak hanya menghasilkan lulusan yang siap bekerja. Kita pastikan bahwa dalam kurikulum itu menjadi the latest state of the art Kementerian Keuangan, tetapi tentunya lulusan kita menjadi insan yang mengabdi kepada publik, manusia publik. Ketika Anda mahasiswa sudah memilih pendidikan kedinasan, ketika Anda selesai dari SMA atau sederajat, maka Anda di saat itu sudah memilih bahwa Anda akan menjadi manusia publik yang tentu harus mempunyai karakter publik yang profesional, yang berintegritas. Ilmu keuangan negara bukan sekedar kompetensi teknis, tentu kompetensi teknis menjadi fondasi yang penting di kampus, tetapi amanah publik yang harus dijalankan dengan tanggung jawab moral, itu saya pesankan kepada khususnya mahasiswa dan seluruh sivitas akademika. Di slide terakhir, ucapan terima kasih tentunya sebagai penutup, izinkan kami menyampaikan apresiasi setinggi-tingginya kepada seluruh pihak, Ibu Bapak pimpinan BPPK, Pak Ses, terima kasih Ibu Bapak Kapus, terima kasih juga Ibu Bapak pimpinan Kementerian Keuangan Banten yang selama ini menjadi tempat kami bersinergi, berkolaborasi menjadi bagian, Ibu Bapak sekalian berkenan menjadi bagian dari perjalanan PKN STAN, tentunya kepada seluruh anggota Senat dan Ibu Bapak dosen, tenaga kependidikan, mahasiswa, seluruh alumni, dan tentunya salah satu mitra kita University of Canberra yang hadir di pagi hari ini. Terima kasih. 11 tahun PKN STAN adalah hasil kerja kolektif, tidak bisa sendiri, dan perbaikan di kampus itu bukan one off, perbaikan yang harus sustain, perbaikan yang harus terus-menerus dilaksanakan. Meskipun sudah tercapai suatu titik target, maka targetnya harus kita naikkan lagi, dan terlebih karena setiap tahun, bahkan ketika tahun akademik, manusianya berganti. Yang sudah kita didik, sudah kemudian mengabdi, dan kemudian kita akan mempunyai tugas baru mendidik manusia-manusia generasi berikutnya. Kita menyadari tantangan semakin besar, dan oleh karena itu di kesempatan ini kami sekali lagi mengaturkan terima kasih dan mohon perkenan Ibu Bapak pimpinan BPPK, Kementerian Keuangan Banten, dan seluruh sivitas akademika untuk terus meningkatkan sinergi, dan mohon perkenan untuk kiranya Ibu Bapak Pases, Ibu Bapak Kapus, dan juga Ibu Bapak Kakanwil di Kemenkeu Banten untuk terus dapat mendukung upaya kami dalam memperbaiki secara sustainable kampus yang kita cintai. Terima kasih, saya stop di sini. PKN STAN untuk Indonesia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Kami silakan Ibu Ervi Mulyani AK MBA PhD untuk kembali ke tempat.
Selanjutnya, sesi foto bersama. Dengan hormat kami mohon kepada jajaran pimpinan di lingkungan Kementerian Keuangan beserta tamu undangan untuk menuju ke depan panggung. Dan kami mohon kepada jajaran Senat untuk dapat berdiri.
Cek sound.
Sesi foto akan dilakukan dalam 2 pose. Pose pertama, yakni pose formal. Foto akan saya pandu dalam hitungan 3, 2, 1.
Professor Uwe Dulek is an internationally recognized research leader and senior university executive with extensive list of publication and impressive managerial experience. He is currently serving as the Executive Dean at the Faculty of Business, Governance and Law, University of Canberra.
Since 2024, University of Canberra has been a valuable partner of PKN STAN and involved in various collaboration to advance academic excellence in both institutions. So, please, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Uwe Dulek.
Okay, you can hear me? Wonderful. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. That's now a little bit of an echo. Please try to fix that. I hope you can still hear me. What I want to do today is to talk to you about behavioral economics or nudging in action, and I want to take a particular take on public and taxation policy. I know that many of you have had a little bit of exposure to behavioral economics, and you know about the challenges that are there for the Indonesian economy. There you know a lot more than I do. And I hope I can give you a very quick first taster of behavioral economics and see and can show you how it may be useful for your work in the Indonesian government. So what's the program for today or for the next 40 minutes or so? I thought I'd give you a very quick overview what is behavioral economics, and I will start out with maybe asking the question, why should you care, particularly with a focus on taxation public policy. I will then walk you very quickly through how you can apply behavioral economics in your work. And then I give you what I call the low-hanging fruits and tell you a couple of tricks, first insights, how to apply behavioral economics, how to design policies based on behavioral economics. And to sum up at the end, I will try to put behavioral economics into context with technical advances that you may have in your work, or standard economics even. So try to wrap up where behavioral economics could make a difference given the expertise you may already have at your workplace and with your education and your training programs. So what is behavioral economics and why should we care? My colleague, Professor Riana Meyanti, who joined us as well, gave me a little bit of insights into the Indonesian economy, and I found it really interesting to look at some of the data. And we know, for example, that the tax to GDP ratio in Indonesia is significantly lower than it is in comparable other Asia-Pacific countries. And part of the reason, at least based on research, is that there is very low, what you could call voluntary compliance. And what I find always interesting is if when we talk about compliance, you can always ask the question, is that intentionally voluntary low compliance, or do we make it somehow hard to comply? And for that reason, it's sometimes call it unintentionally non-compliance. And we actually find in other areas of research quite a lot of evidence for that. And one part of evidence is actually the research that already has been applied to nudges in the context of taxation in Indonesia. We found out in relatively recently published research that simplification of tax processes make a big difference to increase compliance. And similarly, if we have reminders, we find that this has increased tax filing rates. Right. So these are actually, if we use the language of nudge, these are two types of nudges. The first one are easy nudges, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a couple of minutes. And the other one is an attract nudge to create attention. And that we in both of these cases found out that compliance rates increased is actually a good sign that that this evidence on low voluntary compliance is not that it's intentional non-compliance, but there's a lot of things that can be done not by having higher penalties, but by just thinking about, we'll talk about choice architecture, by how to design this type of environments, the choice environments of taxpayers, to achieve better results. So that's why hopefully I convinced you to care about this a little bit. And what I do now is I'll take you through the ideas behind behavioral economics, why it does make sense to take this behavioral insights, the behavioral knowledge, and combine it with economics, and give you a little bit of a quick taster about how this application can work and how it can be applied in your workplace. So what is nudge, or where does it come from? I would say Daniel Kahneman and with his course Amos Tversky about 35 years ago looked at a lot of economic decisions, and tax payments would be one of them, and more or less documented that people don't behave rational or perfectly rational as we usually assume in economics. So the Homo economicus is a great character for the work as economists, It helps us to predict how people behave or should behave if they are highly rational. But we can find lots of situations, and these are just a couple of ways to look at them, where there are systematic deviations from rational behavior, right? So we can derive what is definitely in the best interest of an individual, what a perfect decision looks like. As Homo economicus, people should behave that way, but we find there's systematic difference from that. I give you one, and the only thing that they do differently is they first ask a question that somebody's more than 150 years old, or got to the age of more than 150 years, or he died younger than 10. So both not questions that have any meaning, but the answer of people based on these anchors differed if I afterwards asked them to guess how old these people were when they died. So there's an interesting story to that by asking an irrelevant question before you ask a question of judgment or a question of knowledge, that this influences the answer. So completely irrelevant information changes how people treat this type of problems. And you can ask yourself, like if you are in a government position, you have to make a decision about, let's say, investing in a project and whether the return is right or wrong. Maybe it makes a difference whether when you walk to your office, you see an ad where somebody sells something really cheap, or you see an ad where you hear about a very high cost item, for example, that this could already influence your decisions. So this type of behavioral evidence is very robust. All of these biases are well documented in the literature. If I do longer talks, I actually do with people experiments, and 95% of the time you can reproduce, even with small groups, these type of biases. So that's the first input. We know that rational decisions are great for economic models, but in reality, there are situations where we systematically deviate from those first best decisions. Now, the two authors that took this a step further are these two gentlemen, Carl Sunstein and Richard Thaler. They wrote the book Nudge. That's now almost 20 years ago. So what the two of them said is, if we have these systematic biases that can be found, and people very robustly behave different than we expect them to behave in certain situations, then government or policymakers or the tax office should actually help people to make the right decisions by engaging what they call choice architecture. So think about designing decisions for people so that they can make better decisions for themselves, right? So you avoid them from engaging in criminal behavior. We can talk about healthier behaviors. We can talk about saving for retirement, all relevant decisions, relevant for government, but also for the individual. And we apply economics to find out what's actually first best for government, but also for the individual. And we apply behavioral insights, or this work on biases, on systematic deviations, to create decision environments, government services, policies that lead to better decisions for people. And what is really important, the idea is you help people to make better decisions for themselves. So not to engage in wrongdoing, like tax non-compliance when you're caught could be very costly for the individual. But you more or less do that with interventions that don't force people to make different decisions, but you help people to make the right decisions. So let's think about how this could look like. So here is a very simple recipe how you can think about these problems. And then we look at a couple of tricks to apply these. this is the process that I've worked with a team of colleagues at my previous university, and the center was called Behavioral Economics, Society and Technology. For that reason, our process is called the best idea. So what does that mean? It's a 4-step procedure, and the idea is more or less that you first create insight, or you identify the problem. That's the I stage step. And you can say, well, economics, for example, can help you. What are problems that you have? Talked in the introduction about the observation that the tax to GDP ratio in Indonesia is significantly lower than other countries, and that voluntary compliance, may be a substantial explanation for that. Right? We can then ask from economics, what would a perfect outcome look like? So really think about this analysis of first best or normative benchmark setting. So we need some sort of, where do we want to go? Right? And we can think about what's the data that we need to design that. All of that is very much standard economics and identifying the problem, trying to find out what do we want to achieve. Call it the KPI. What other expertise gives us, and this could be the behavioral science, but it could also be technical knowledge in certain areas, is to actually say, where are opportunities to understand why people deviate from what is optimal behavior. So we want to focus on situations where people deviate from what would be first best behavior, what would be homo economicus behavior. And if we understand these type of problems, then we can use the behavioral sciences to actually develop solutions. And I cover a bit more on what do I mean by developing solutions by talking about the EAST framework, which gives you a couple of ideas on how to do that. And then we get back to what economists are good at. We have econometric methods to more or less learn whether our interventions work. And you can look deeper into that. I will not cover much of that, but I show you some of the results of research that has been done to evaluate interventions. And a lot of the statistics are actually pretty simple, but you can use more advanced econometric techniques for this evaluation, but also for the policy design. And we can talk about that a bit more. This was a research center where we developed the idea. So when we talk about achieving results, it was not just implementation, but there was also the idea of publishing research, contributing to knowledge, but also training public servants. And we did that for quite some time. I'm still delivering for the Australian Public Service very often short courses on how to develop behavioral economic policies and implement them and look at certain problems. Now, I just gave you an overview of the idea that we used at my previous university at QUT. The interesting thing is that all behavioral economics groups, and I just give you two other examples, have a similar idea about, it's always a 4-step procedure, interesting enough, to develop policy interventions. And it's like they go a little bit more into, put a little bit more effort into the design phase. They put a little bit more effort into the context, the policy environment, but it's almost always we get to this these different stages to first define a problem, identify a problem, discover the problem, then look at the problem, try to understand where do we deviate from some first best, then apply some behavioral insights to design solutions, and finally think about implementation and how can we track whether an intervention works or not. So the type of processes are always the same. What's the most important part? And I tried to talk about that before as a first step. And I call this the Mr. Spock test or the Sheldon test. Depending on your age, you may remember that Mr. Spock was an officer on the Starship Enterprise who was hyper-rational. Sheldon is maybe the current day counterpart in the comedy series, where you have somebody who's super rational and only makes rational decisions. Why do I talk about the Mr. Spock or the Sheldon test? What I would always say, if you think about applying behavioral economics, you want to look at situations where people make decisions that Mr. Spock or Sheldon wouldn't do. So what do I mean by that? We really want to focus on areas where people make a mistake from what would be highly rational behavior. That's where behavioral economics is applied. So it's not like the usual policy context where you say, well, we need to have, let's say, a tax or a subsidy to change behavior. That changes the underlying economic incentives, and therefore people should make different decisions, but Sheldon or Mr. Spock would make these different decisions as well. So these are decisions where people act against their own best interest, right? They do make a mistake that could cost them a penalty that's very expensive. Maybe more importantly, it could be detrimental to their health. So very prominent nudges you could imagine would be nudges against smoking, where we know smoking is not particularly good for your health, or wearing seatbelts in cars or driving carefully, where you know if you don't do that, it can have dramatic consequences for you. So we look at situations where we want to look at behavioral economics, where you have exactly this type of unintentional wrong behavior. It's not intentional, where people really reflect on this and make very strong choices to behave in the wrong way. It's about behavior that's not in the best interest of the individual, that is unintentional. That's quite important. So the first step is always, and that's maybe something you can take away. If you think about policy problems in your work, ask the question whether this is purely intentional behavior or whether there is this behavioral bias that is at work. And you can already start thinking about which bias may that be. Have a look at the book by Kahneman, this Thinking Fast and Slow book. He actually explains a lot of these biases, but you could also look at some of the literature on biases if you have an idea there. So we have a situation where people do something that's not in their own best interest. And then how can we think about that? What I show you now, and it's very quick, very much an executive summary, are 4 ideas that you can apply, and they capture actually a lot of interventions that can make a difference already for decision making. So this is called the EAST framework, because we talk about trying to make the right decision, the best decision for the individual, easy for the decision maker, or we try to make it attractive, try to make it social, or we try to get the timing right, because we know if we do that, we get better outcomes. This book by David Halpern is a very good book to get an insight how this work was done within the UK government. And there are lots of examples, and I capture some of them in the next couple of slides, to see how easy it can be, not just an easy nudge, but how relatively straightforward it can be to make a difference in policy outcomes with these small changes. So where the economist or the home economic will say, well, this shouldn't make a difference whether you have this default or that default, because people make conscious decisions, we see, for example, defaults matter. And that's already one of the examples. If you think about a policy that there is a default, choosing this default right makes already a difference for outcomes. Another example, and that's one that I like particularly, here it's an example of a hospital prescription, because this is very nice data. But if you think, a lot of governments work with forms, not anymore paper forms, very often online forms, and getting a form right and having on the form good defaults can make a huge difference to achieve better compliance or better outcomes for the situation that you want to look at. We have done experiments on taxation, for example, where we worked with different levels of pre-populated information in a tax declaration. And if you do that and you provide the correct information for people to report on their taxes, then you get better outcomes. People are more honest. If you give them the information. If they have to recall information themselves, they tend to bias the information in a direction that is better for them. Again, if you make them aware of that, many people actually want to be honest. So there is a premium. People prefer to be honest on these things. So if we can help them to be honest, we get better outcomes. We make it easy to be honest in this case. Here are other examples. And I stayed on the tax example, but it's nice to have the type of visuals. This was taxation on cars. In the UK, Australia, we have the same problem. People forget to re-register their cars or pay their cars on taxes. And just by how the message was reported to people that they are late in their payment, or even the reminder that they need to renew, made a difference. So the more personal we could make it, whether we could add photos or the name, the model, a lot of details on that, instead of just the whatever bureaucratic standard letter, we get better outcomes. Now, if you look at the numbers, they're not huge, right? You got about 40% with the standard letter. You get up to 48% if you put a lot of work in there. But you know from your work that increasing compliance by 2 to 3 to 5 to 8% are actually quite substantial improvements. So it's not that we move from almost no compliance to 100% compliance, but we can make this difference that increases, in this case, the amount of taxes paid on car registrations. And important, compared to many other policy interventions that you could think about how to increase tax compliance, it's relatively cheap. If you think about it, you anyway send a letter. Usually you send the standard letter on the very left. Now you send a letter that's slightly customized, but we can do that nowadays with computers easily, and you get better outcomes, right? So the important part here is that nudges are very often cheap, and they can significantly increase compliance. We don't get to 100%, but we get better, right? We have almost a 20% increase in the comparison of the standard letter to this letter 3. So 2 nudges we had already, easy nudges. How can we use defaults, make it easier to comply? The second one was, how can we attract attention? The idea is more or less to get people to really carefully think about their decision, and that helps then that we get better decisions. The next one is telling people what others do. And as an economist, you may think about, oh, that makes sense, right? You could actually look at it from 2 ways. One is very much an economic way, is saying people learn from others. So if you see that others do certain behavior, you should do something similar, because most likely it's smart what others do, right? And similarly, you could say, well, you don't want to be too different from others. That would be a more behavioral explanation. Both of them are strong signals to say, look, if you provide information about what others do, it will help you to get more of the behavior you want to do if the majority of people behaves right. And very often that's the case. Why is that the case? particularly in the context of taxation, there's a lot of work that has shown that we are actually somehow expecting that others are less honest than we are ourselves. So if you can share information that shows that most people are honest, it increases honesty in this context a lot more. And again, very simple to do. It's just providing information a slightly different way than we have done traditionally. Here's one detour that I want to take at this point, and try to raise the awareness that I show you data, I show you a lot of these tricks, I show them to you in a very quick way. It's really this taster of that. A lot of this needs a little bit of research. And the reason why I say it needs a little bit of research is there's also work that shows where nudges went wrong. So there are examples where, in the UK, immigration officers were told that colleagues have been caught for selling work visas, and that actually led to more wrong behavior. And the nudge was just not going in the right direction, right? Instead of telling people, look, it's dangerous to do that, and make them more aware, people just got the idea and behaved in a wrong way, right? Similarly, you had signs in doctor surgeries about missing appointments is bad for others, right? And the way it was interpreted is not that they thought, oh, I try to avoid to create this problem, but people seem to interpret it more, oh, I'm not the only one. It's actually okay to do that, right? And we have a couple of this type of evidence. Why do I talk about that? I just try to raise the awareness. We want to see the data, not just the story, and see whether the bias actually that you have identified, hopefully, when you chose your problem for a behavioral economic intervention, works in the way that you expect it to work. I hope that makes sense. So there's a little bit of a safeguard. You want to actually evaluate whether a nudge works, because you may actually get a different result from what you expected. Why? Well, we have lots of these biases, and you don't know which bias actually applies always. So you use them to design your intervention, but then you want to find out whether they work. I find the social nudges are particularly good to explain that, but I have one more nudge for you, and then we can already sum up. And you saw at the introduction the work about reminders. Reminders are one example of a timely nudge. So what you can find out with very many decisions, and you can look at that, that reminding people when it is time to make a payment, for example, for your tax, can make a difference on whether people do that or not. Maybe you know yourself from maybe your studies that if you have too long a time that a reminder gets to you, or somebody says you have to do something within the next month, it's not as useful if you would get compared to when you would get this type of reminder maybe a week before something is due. So it depends on how much time do you need to actually do the work and get the time, the reminder at a time when it's really relevant. And we can look at that. You can actually try to understand getting these timing right has a difference on compliance rates or on the types of behavior that you want to achieve. And we can ask how this could look like. Here's another example of a timely nudge, and a very prominent one. This was about retirement savings. It's very worthwhile looking into this as an example, because such a clear case of a nice behavioral economics. And this was actually planning prompts. So we know that if we ask people to make certain decisions and we give them a way to commit, or even to just write down when they want to do this decision, it can make a difference. So another way to look at timely prompts is this type of idea to get commitment or planning done before, because once people have a plan, it's actually more likely that they do it. So where are we? So what I just try to explain to you is we can combine economics, the economic way of thinking, or policy thinking, if you want to take that. We can combine it with behavioral insights and design interventions for that. These interventions can work with making it easier for people to do the right thing, attracting attention, that people actually consciously make a decision where it has to, where you want to influence the decision to be more rational, to be more informed by reflection. And it can be by providing information about what other people do, or you can work with the time or planning that happens. So this is why we call it the EAST framework. Here is how I would think about that in a policy context. And I think it's really helpful to look at these things and maybe consider them if you look at problems that you face in your work for government or any large organization. Right? I feel very often where we see that behaviors are not, or outcomes that we see are not the most efficient, the best outcomes, right? From this economics perspective, we can actually start to try to understand what are the barriers. So what stands in the way to achieve these outcomes, and what are possible enablers or solutions, ways to overcome this problem, right? And I think there are a lot of problems that are technical in nature, right? We may need a certain type of technology to achieve outcomes that we currently don't have. You can think about it maybe harder or easier to submit tax declarations via an online platform, or does it need to be an app? How could we, what is best technology there? How can we make maybe government operate more effectively using technology? So that would be technical solutions, and there may be technical barriers as well, right? If people don't have the type of technical literacy, we may need to think about how can we help to overcome that. Then you may have economic problems. I always talk about incentives and disincentives to behave in a certain way. And this is usually our policy intervention. So economics maybe helps us with technology to capture where problems are. And if we want to look at economic solutions, we do play with the incentives and disincentives, the cost and benefits of behavior. What I hope I could convince you that, and we did this in a very quick fashion, that there's a lot of behaviors where we are not behaving fully rational and we are driven by, call it our automatic decision making. Kahneman talks about system one decision making. And for that reason, we deviate from this rational behavior. And if we understand these behavioral biases right, we actually can identify them and potentially harness them or employ them to help people to make better decisions. That's this idea of choice architecture. So if you think about policy problems, maybe from now on, or at least maybe this afternoon, you could actually ask, is it a technological problem? Is it an economic problem? Or is it a behavioral problem? And how can we address those problems with different tools? And how do we complement maybe some technical solutions with behavioral insights to make them better used? That's what design is a little bit about, right? And how can we amplify maybe the effect of an economic policy by attracting attention, that people actually consider the consequences in the correct way. If I think about trying to incentivize people to use more energy efficient appliances, part of it is an economic incentive, but can we use behavioral interventions to help actually to amplify that? So in my eyes, if I take this perspective as an economist turned behavioral economist, I think looking at these three different dimensions is very helpful to look at problems and try to create solutions for them. And that's it. I hope I haven't been boring you for too long. I think I'm pretty much on time. If you have questions, I provide you with my email address. Please reach out. Professor Miranti is also part of the call, and I know some of you know her quite well, and she offered to be open for questions as well. Thank you very much.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, selesai sudah rangkaian sidang Senat dan orasi ilmiah Diesnatalis ke-11 Politeknik Keuangan Negara STAN tahun 2026. Kami juga turut mengingatkan kepada rekan-rekan mahasiswa untuk tidak lupa melakukan presensi di meja registrasi.
Selamat siang. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Santi 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 Om. Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan untuk kita semua.